So welcome everyone. Welcome to the Department of International Development's Interrogating Development Seminar Series. So this is a bi-weekly event organized by the Department of International Development here at King's. And we'll drop the program in the chat box so that you can see what we have coming up in the weeks to come. So my name is Ingrid van Graven, and I'm co-organizing this and co-hosting this seminar series with my colleague Judeo-Christian, who you can see here on the screen with me. And each week we visit a big new book that's pertinent for international development. So we're very excited to welcome the second speaker of our spring term lineup today, Howard French, who is the professor of journalism at Columbia University in New York City, a global affairs writer, and the author of 5 books. Howard worked as a French-English translator in Abidjan, Ivory Coast in the early 80s, and taught English literature for several years at the University of Abidjan. His career in journalism began as a freelance reporter for the Washington Post and other publications in West Africa. And he later worked for the New York Times and won a lot of prestigious journalism awards. And his most recent book is Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War, which is what he's here to talk about today. And we've been given a discount code for the book that we'll drop in the chat as well. So that would give you 25% discount at checkout. So it's a very beautiful book, so I do recommend it. We're also privileged to have with us today an excellent discussant, Professor Toby Green. And Toby is professor of pre-colonial and Lusophone African history and culture here at King's. He's a historian of West Africa, and his work seeks to contribute towards a refocusing of the understanding of modern history by grasping the roles of West Africans in shaping world history. So his research interests are broadly structured around West African engagement with the early Atlantic world through several themes, including economic change, cultural transformation, and slavery. So we'll start with Howard presenting his book, Born in Blackness, before we'll hear comments from Toby. And then we'll give Howard a chance to respond as well before opening up to the floor. So we'll make sure that there's plenty of time for you to ask questions as well. And you can see the Q&A box here at the bottom of your Zoom app. And you can put questions and comments there at any time, and we'll pick them up during the Q&A session. So that is all from me. I'll pass the floor over to you, Howard. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Thank you, Sudhir, who is helping run things, and thank you for Toby, who is, as Ingrid said, my discussant. I just want to say a special word about Toby, whose scholarship and writing have been so vital to me in my own, the development of my own understanding of so many of the things I touch upon in my book. And Toby and I have never had the privilege of meeting before in person, and so this is as close as it's gotten so far, and it's just it's delightful to be with you. So
it's my pleasure as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I'll start at the beginning, and that is with the title of the book. I'm not going to repeat the full title, but the title has a couple of key elements to it. One of them is Born in Blackness, and the other one is the word modernity. And modernity is, of course, a term that is open to a lot of contestation and debate over definitions, and there's no really neat way to summarize what modernity should mean to all who encounter that word. But in writing this book, I sort of proceeded from a very commonplace understanding, whether or not the specialists among us accept this definition, but a very commonplace understanding that begins, I think, in our school child age of what modernity is. And that is that modernity sort of proceeded from events that arose in 15th century Europe and were centered around an effort to discover sea routes to the east, meaning to Asia, which in the first instance meant what we now know of as India and eventually meant China, right? And that this culminated quite by accident, as it happens, with the quote unquote discovery of the Americas by the very famous Christopher Columbus, who doesn't need any introduction to you. And so if we accept this as a kind of crude working definition, of what where modernity begins, without sort of opening the trunk of what modernity actually means in any great detail. My book proceeds from a deconstruction of that story. And it proceeds from a deconstruction of that story that arose out of very particular circumstances for me. My previous book, I've spent a great deal of my life working in Africa and working on the topic of Africa, but my immediate prior experience as a correspondent, meaning overseas for the New York Times for many years, was in East Asia. And I spent 6 years in, 5 years in Japan and then 6 years in China. And when I was posted in Japan, I had the responsibility of covering the two Koreas as well. And so I had very broad experience of East Asia. And throughout my time in East Asia, I was struck by how present the question is in the minds of East Asians, of how it is that the West ended up diverging, so to speak, in terms of wealth and power at a certain moment in history. Most people would position this moment in history somewhere roughly in the 19th century, right? How did this happen, and why did it happen? And what does it say about these different civilizations, if you accept that that we can speak that way, of different civilizations? And so when I left China, which was my last posting overseas for the Times, after a few years, and actually with a couple of books in between, I ended up writing my immediate previous book prior to this one was a book that's sort of a meditation on that question, and a history, if you will, of Chinese conceptions of themselves as a power, as a world power, and where do those notions arise from, and how do Chinese people process thoughts about China's place in the world, and how has this changed over time? Excuse me for this long windup. Africa hasn't entered into the conversation yet, but in the research for that book, I began to encounter, or I began to read 15th century and 16th century Portuguese accounts of exploration and eventual discovery of these sea passages to the east, which were supposedly the Holy Grail, the great quest that launched modernity. And in my exploration or perusal of those texts, I was astounded to discover that, in fact, the Portuguese spent a very substantial amount of time engaging with Africa prior to even seriously attempting to reach the east by sea. And as someone who is at the very least curious-minded, I'm speaking of myself, and reasonably well-educated, and I think also reasonably well-read and globally minded, I was astounded by this. Astounded never to have seen any hint of this in any of the literature of the emergence of modernity that I had encountered up until that point in time. And so this planted a seed in my mind back then, while I was working on a very different book that I kind of put aside and knew that I must return to. And that's kind of the proximate cause of this present book that we're gathered here to discuss today. What was most astounding to me, beyond that initial encounter with this literature, which we can talk about if you'd like, was as the more I looked into this, I found certain tropes about this era. We're speaking about the 15th century now, and how it is that European exploration, and in particular Iberian exploration, ends up with the discovery, quote unquote, of the Americas. Africa is very routinely described as an obstacle, as an inert space, as a place with no inherent interest to the Europeans of its own, which merely has to be, the challenge was how to circumnavigate Africa, how to get around this immense geography so that the Europeans could finally reach the place where civilizations and wealth of sufficient scale in their minds existed, and which were worthy of undertaking grand voyages and big expeditions of discovery and connection. And I find these tropes repeated over time, and including in very recent books, as well as, books that date back even 100 years or more. And So as this project took shape in my mind and I explored this literature of actually contemporaneous accounts of Portuguese explorers, I've already used the word astounded, but I was, what's a better way to say it? I was, in Britain, you would say gobsmacked, I guess, by how bluntly the record contradicts the legend. So what is the record? The record is that in the early 1400s, the Portuguese, who were then under a dynasty called the Avis, which was still quite young and fragile, seized upon the idea of, and when I say the record, I'm speaking about things written by the Portuguese themselves in this era. So seized upon the idea of prioritizing exploration of Africa by sea as a way of establishing themselves on the Iberian Peninsula and giving them the wherewithal to stand up against the covetousness of, I'm going to call it Spain, even though it wasn't called Spain in that era yet, okay? So the Portuguese were worried because they were poor and fragile that the Spanish would try to conquer them and reabsorb them into the Spanish domain. And they needed a strategy. How do we get onto our feet? They had little more than dried fish and salt and cork and very crude trade items to sustain themselves economically. And the Portuguese, the record is very clear, decided that their moonshot, their long odds bid for survival would be predicated on trying to connect with Africa. And in specific, so this begins in North Africa, but in specific from a very early time, trying to connect with West Africa. And so this makes me probe further to understand why it is that first, we'll put aside the question of how could the literature that we're mostly all familiar with omit this story altogether so thoroughly, right? But beyond that, this put me on a path of trying to understand, where did this obsession arise from? If in fact it is true, as the contemporaneous record of Portuguese exploration makes very clear, the Portuguese were determined to connect by sea with West Africa, what drove that? And so this puts one on the path of another extraordinary set of stories. And these stories begin a century prior to the early 1400s, when in West Africa, in the Sahel region, just south of the Sahara, under a kingdom or empire, depending on which nomenclature one wishes to apply. Another very impressive geopolitical bid arose. And this is the Mali Empire, or the Kingdom of Mali. And under it's a rather enigmatic figure because there's so little written record about him. But under a figure named Abu Bakr II, there is indeed a written record, and I'll explain to you what that consists of an attempt, however ill-prepared or ill-conceived, to discover lands on the far side of the Atlantic. So we're talking about the early 1300s. This is almost 2 centuries before Christopher Columbus reaches the Americas. In a kingdom in West Africa, whose gravitational center is far inland, there existed rulers who had notions that, or at least were capable of speculating to the point of making big investments in the discovery of lands on the other, they didn't call it the Atlantic Ocean, but lands on the other side of the great ocean that we know of as the Atlantic. And so as the story goes, this ruler mounts 2 great expeditions to, in fact, discover these lands. The first of them, West Africa, let me just pause to say, in that era and for a long time afterwards, lacked certainly large masted sailing vessels. And so this would have by perforce been an effort to conduct long distance ocean navigation by basically large dugout canoes. That's what we believe anyway. We don't have any archaeological record of what I'm talking about, but that makes the most sense. Anyway, this ruler, Abu Bakr II, in the early 1300s, mounts two grand expeditions. The first of them never returns. No, I'm sorry, excuse me, that's wrong. The first of them returns with one or a very small number of survivors, or perhaps only one survivor, who gives an account of arriving at a point in the sea where currents converge from different directions very violently, and most of the vessels were lost. And by the way, I forgot to mention that Mali's wealth was based on control of the gold trade across a very large swath of West Africa. And we're talking about prodigious amounts of gold. And so Abu Bakr II, when he mounted these two expeditions, and we're still just talking about the first of them, provisioned these boats, these dugouts, with large amounts of gold. And so the Malians set out trying to cross what we know of the Atlantic carrying lots of gold, which provokes very interesting questions, which we cannot, unfortunately, probably ever resolve. But what were they trying to do? What was the intention? Anyway, so perhaps only one, or at the most, very few people survived that first bid. And rather than cut his losses, Abu Bakr II decides that he's going to mount an even bigger attempt to cross the Atlantic. And in fact, he's going to set out onto the sea himself at the helm of the lead vessel. Abu Bakr II never returns. In other words, in all likelihood, he died at sea. There are other possible ways of explaining the stories that we're talking about, but this is a story that comes down to us in a very particular way in the written record left from an interview by a successor of Abu Bakr II, who in the year 1324 sets off via another method across very large distances to engage in global diplomacy. And this successor's name is Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa will be a name familiar to some of you, unfamiliar to others, but someone who is often called, and I don't really know how one measures these things, as possibly the richest person who has ever lived. So Mansa Musa in 1324 sets off on camelback with an extraordinarily large procession to reach Cairo and Mecca. Mali is, in that era, at least the Malian elite in that era was Muslim. And Mansa Musa sets off on this grand voyage overland, crossing the Sahara to pilgrimage at Mecca. And he bears with him, the record says, we believe, 18 tons of pure gold. No one has ever seen, before or since, in the possession and control of a single individual, such amounts of gold. And Mansa Musa begins to, what shall I say, organize acts of patronage and charity and political largesse along the way, and especially in Cairo. And as the story goes, so much gold was depleted. In fact, all of the gold was depleted, because in the end, Mansa Musa actually had to borrow money to get back to Mali, which is an extraordinary thing in and of itself. But so much gold was distributed that the price of gold in the sort of broad Mediterranean world is said to have collapsed for a number of years, perhaps a decade, perhaps more. And so this sends word, this sends news of African wealth deep into Europe. And it sets off a number of extraordinary events. One of the most immediate importance to us is it sets off a kind of frenzy among map makers, using the European map makers, using the little tidbits of knowledge they had of African geography, mostly collected from people who had traded on the northern fringe, Europeans who had traded along the northern fringes or the southern fringes of the Sahara, I think quite often Jewish traders. And that this results in a number of, for that era, ever more detailed and geographically correct maps that try to situate this Malian empire somewhere in the interior of Africa. The most famous of these maps, one of the most important maps in the history of map making, in my view, and one of the most beautiful maps I know, figures on the cover of my book. And I don't mean this as an advertisement. We have, Ingrid spoke about how beautiful the book was. I agree, but the map really deserves its place there because of its centrality to this story. And so this is what creates the drive eventually over time by the Portuguese to figure out a way to West Africa by sea. And this is the reason that they center their survival strategy vis-a-vis the Spanish on Africa, as opposed to the Asia that they were supposedly hell-bent on trying to reach. I'm not saying that the Portuguese had no interest in Asia. I'm not saying the Spanish had no interest in Asia. I'm saying that in this specific period of history, it was West Africa that was the center of Iberian interest in terms of maritime exploration, and in fact played the pivotal role in launching the modern age. Okay, I have to sort of tie one little bow and then we'll move forward. So back to the Abu Bakr II story. Why is this even worth mentioning? First of all, I am not claiming that Africans reached the so-called New World. I am not claiming that Abu Bakr II or any Malian knew about the Americas in any detail other than the sort of conceptual possibility that land existed on some far shores of the Atlantic Ocean. But it's important to recognize why that would not have been such a strange thought. And then it's important to think about what could have been the geopolitical motives involved here. So why this wasn't necessary, what shouldn't be thought of as such an extraordinary thought, even though Europeans still believed almost universally that the world was flat in this era. In the Muslim world, in the Arab world in specific, the world had been understood to be round for quite some time already. And Mali was an Islamic culture. Abu Bakr II was not the first Malian to go on pilgrimage to Mecca. Islamic texts already circulated in Mali at that time. And so the notion that the world was round should not strike us, for a Malian, should not strike us as being unusual. Moreover, Christopher Columbus went to his deathbed believing that he had reached Japan and China, because Christopher Columbus had misunderstood the actual size of the Earth. He thought that the Earth was much smaller, in fact, than it was, and therefore, by his calculations, he should be in Asia after having traversed the distance of ocean that he had. And so it is plausible for me to believe not only did Abu Bakr II think that there was, given the Earth is round, that there's land somewhere on the other side, but that since maybe he also thought the Earth is smaller than it is, and that this is might be a survivable voyage even in large dugout canoes. Anyway, the final thing I'll say about that is that this is not an oral history. This is written history. This comes down to us via an interview or a conversation that Mansa Musa had with the Mamluk governor of Cairo during his pilgrimage on his route to Mecca. And so this comes down to us by a contemporary account given by Abu Bakr II's successor in Cairo, written in Arabic by a scribe who puts this down in a book. And so this doesn't prove 100% that these events happened, but as history of the sort of Middle Ages go, this is a pretty solid piece of documentation. Anyway, so what were the possible geopolitical interests involved here? And I think one can draw a line through Abu Bakr II and Mansa Musa. Of a succession of kingdoms in North Africa controlled as middlemen Mali's trade and the trade of Mali's predecessor, the Kingdom of Ghana, which is quite distinct from the modern country of Ghana, which we will discuss in a few minutes, located in roughly the same area that Mali is located in, the Sahel. So these these Sahelian kingdoms traded their gold with Europe for hundreds of years, going back probably to the year 800 or 1000 or something, somewhere in that region, right? But that gold always transited the Sahara via these middlemen in North Africa, who, as middlemen are wont to do, took big cuts and sometimes took offensive actions, militarily speaking, to the south to try to seize control of the gold themselves, right? And so as I try to imagine what the geopolitical imperatives would have been for these two rulers, and I use the word imagine because there's no documentation for this. Is my own attempt at understanding. What strikes me as most possible is that Abu Bakr II and Mansa Musa, by their very two different means, were seeking different outlets for Mali's gold, seeking to end run around the control of the North Africans to find markets for what was then and for quite some time to follow the single most prolific source of gold in the world. And that if in their minds, had their gambit succeeded, they would have made a lot more money and acquired much more wealth and probably power by establishing these new trade routes, in the first instance, across the Atlantic, in the second instance, into the Mamluk Empire of Egypt and beyond, than was possible by selling their gold through the various kingdoms that controlled North Africa. Okay. So how does this lead us to the modern world? A name that many of you will know, that a person who plays a very big part in all of this, is Henry the Navigator, who is a prince of the Aviz dynasty in Portugal. And as the third son of the king, this is the person who has almost literally no chance of becoming the king himself one day. And so he creates a number of vocations for himself to achieve some kind of prominence and stature within the scheme of things in terms of the Aviz dynasty. And he becomes the head of the Order of Christ. And he also becomes the chief promoter, organizer, and financier of what I have called this Portuguese moonshot, this attempt to connect with West Africa. And that is why we know him as Henry the Navigator, which is really interesting, given that Africa has been cut out of the conventional story and described as an obstacle, as opposed to a place of inherent priority interest itself. Henry the Navigator's entire life was bound up insofar as he was busy organizing navigation. He didn't actually go on the boats himself, by the way, but insofar as he was involved in promoting navigation, his career was almost entirely bound up in Africa. So Henry the Navigator begins to organize a number of exploratory ventures down the coast of West Africa in the early to mid 1400s. And in order to do this, the Portuguese had to overcome their own technological limitations in terms of the rather crude nature of their sailing vessels, as well as their geographical misconceptions and superstitions, i.e. the world is flat, there's dragons just over the horizon, and the closer you get to the equator, the more literally unlivable the temperature becomes. It was believed then that the equator was actually like hell. You burn to death if you get to the equator. And so Henry the Navigator, in organizing these voyages, had to find ways of overcoming this. And he basically commissions a bunch of minor nobles to lead these expeditions down the coast of West Africa, and tells them essentially that you will get a major cut of the trade goods if you were able to establish successful commerce with these unknown parts of the West African coast, with it being known from the very beginning that gold was the priority. So in the interest of time, because this is a book that covers 600 years of history, and I'm so far only really touching on the beginning of the story, I'm going to have to accelerate things quite a bit. So in 1471, sometime after Henry the Navigator's death, one of these voyages arrives in the place that we now call Ghana, a distinct geography from the Ghana Empire I referred to earlier. And in Ghana, it was found almost immediately that there was so much gold that even ordinary people wore gold as jewelry and adornments. And so the Portuguese knew right away that they had arrived in a very special place, and this was confirmed very quickly. And so this is the 1471 in my book's title, and I believe the most appropriate year, if one has to name a year, a single year, for discussing the beginning of the modern world. And that is because this sets into motion a number of super important events, including eventually Columbus's discovery, quote unquote, of the Americas. And so this gold that the Portuguese discover, after discovering this gold in Ghana, they set up a very strong trade in gold with the Ghanaians. Something important happens. The Portuguese are still quite poor. They don't have trade goods that the Ghanaians are terribly interested in acquiring in exchange for their gold. And so the Portuguese are forced to strengthen trade circuits of their own with Northern European countries that were quite tenuous and primitive in that time. So this is the beginning of some very important intra-European trade circuits that was driven by West Africa. And as the Portuguese begin to acquire trade goods in Germany and the Low Countries and various other places in northern parts of Europe, and then proceed back to Africa to exchange with I'm going to call them Ghanaians. That's not the appropriate term, but for facility's sake, the Ghanaians. The Spanish, always hovering in the background, become envious of the Portuguese success. We have good reason to believe that over the first, let's say, 3 decades of this trade, the gold supply that the Portuguese got from this place that we now know of as Ghana amounted to perhaps a third of the entire crown revenue of Portugal. It is this crown revenue which allows Portugal to set off on a number of kind of ambitious new paths, to build fleets of exploration, to prompt new voyages. It's important to emphasize this does not launch, as the conventional story would have it, right away a sort of head over heels attempt to reach Asia. Quite the contrary. The Portuguese discover the gold in Ghana in 1471. They don't reach Asia by sea until 1500, roughly. Okay, Vasco da Gama gets to Calicut. That's almost 3 decades later. It's just shy of 3 decades later that Bartholomew Diaz, the person who was accredited with being the first European to enter the Indian Ocean, gets to the Indian Ocean. So what are the Portuguese doing in the meantime? The Portuguese believe that if there's this much gold in Ghana, Africa must be like this in general. And so the Portuguese become totally invested in exploring Africa in this period and establishing connections, politically speaking, diplomatically speaking, as well as economically speaking, with African kingdoms and empires where they found them. And later in my book, much later in my book, I describe very important, historically speaking, and just fascinating in their own right, political relations that the Portuguese established with one of the most important African kingdoms of this era in Congo, which was a kingdom that we conventionally spell as a K, that dates from the early modern or late Middle Ages and early modern period. Before that happens, though, the Portuguese discover off the coast of Central Africa an island that we now identify as Sao Tome. And Sao Tome sits almost exactly on the equator, and it's not far from the African mainland, but it's uninhabited. And some unknown person among these Portuguese explorers settled upon the idea of planting sugar experimentally on Sao Tome. Sugar was a recently developed commercial crop in the European context. The Portuguese had pioneered the planting of sugar very recently at this time in places like the Canary Islands and Madeira and islands like that far to the north in the Atlantic. And so some Portuguese person brought sugarcane to Sao Tome and planted it there and discovered right away that Sao Tome is, environmentally speaking, probably as good a place as sugar as exists for the growing of sugar. And now, as we understand, I'm compressing and I'm accelerating, and I will continue to compress and accelerate quite a bit as we go forward. But as anyone who understands the history of sugar at all over a span of several hundred years knows, sugar is one of the most brutal crops to grow, that commercially speaking crops that we know of. And sugar is deeply associated almost everywhere where it has been produced with enslavement or forced labor of some kind or another. And so the Portuguese then at Sao Tome begin, and I'm going to use the word industrial, a kind of industrialized production of sugar based on the obtention of bound people, enslaved people from coastal Africa, either in places like contemporary Nigeria or from the region of Congo itself. And this is where what we know of as the plantation was invented or perfected. And it is my argument that the plantation, meaning actually plantation is, I believe, a terrible euphemism that deserves to be exploded and reframed. The plantation is really a prison, an industrial prison labor camp, where people are regimented and organized violently and deprived of their freedom and forced to work. Their productivity is extracted from them and they are deprived of all rights. And so it is in Sao Tome where this euphemism called the plantation is sort of perfected, and where a kind of racialized slavery for the first time is applied on a large scale involving Africans, where an equation is created between Blackness and slavery in the minds of Europeans, where to be Black means to be appropriately used or exploited as a slave. Interesting coincidence, geographically and historically speaking, chronologically speaking, right around this time, meaning the very early 1500s, the Portuguese, quote unquote, discover Brazil. Brazil is at almost, actually not almost, Brazil is at the exact same latitude as Sao Tome. The Portuguese weren't trying to discover Brazil. They were tacking across the Atlantic. They had discovered that to get down the coast of Africa, the quickest way was to sail westward and to tack back eastward. And they began to do that more and more. And they finally reached the Brazilian coast by accident. And so they take possession of Brazil. And over the sort of beginning in the mid decades of the 1500s and accelerating in the latter part of the 1500s, the Portuguese begin to grow sugar on an industrial scale using the model that was created in Sao Tome. And I'm going to attack a second pervasive myth that we have about the creation of the Atlantic world in saying that the most famous sort of imperial stories about the acquisition of wealth that we have of Europeans, wealth by Europeans in this era, involves Spanish conquistadors, small groups of brave men who set off and against incredible odds defeat very large kingdoms in places like Mexico and in South America, et cetera, and then begin to extract enormous amounts of wealth, which in the form of precious metals, silver and gold, and sail them across the oceans in boats called galleons. These are the most famous stories about wealth, the attention of wealth by Europeans in this era. I contend in my book, and I believe there are strong reasons that this is actually not terribly debatable, that sugar in this era, meaning beginning in the late 1500s, by the late 1500s, Europe was making more money from sugar than the Spanish were making from gold, meaning Europe was making more money from the industrial prison labor camp model that we call plantations, using Africans in a form of slavery called chattel, meaning racial slavery, where people are deprived of their rights generationally. Then the Spanish carted off in these much more famous stories, and that in 1630 or the early 1630s, England enters this story, where England copies this technique, this industrial prison labor camp model, and introduces it to the island of Barbados, which was uninhabited at the time of the English arrival in 1627. And in a very short period of time, on that little island, 1/3 the size of the city of Los Angeles, England was making more money from the industrial prison labor camp model than the Spanish made in all of the sacking of the Incas and the Aztecs and things like that in Latin America, in what we now know of as Latin America. And so being very fast about this, I haven't even gotten into and won't have time in my introductory remarks on the very important cultural and economic impact of all of this within Europe itself, and particularly in Britain. But this model, the industrial prison labor camp model of plantations, sort of makes this transition. It starts off in Sao Tome, it crosses the Atlantic to Brazil, the English copy it and they introduce it to Barbados. The English subsequently defeat the Spanish and take over Jamaica. The French then begin to copy this model in a place they called Saint-Domingue, which we now know of as Haiti. The French are rather late getting into this game in a very big way. Haiti begins to become the site of large-scale sugar production, probably only in the 1730s, and then very rapidly ramps up to the point where by the late 1700s, Saint-Domingue, subsequently Haiti, is the largest producer of sugar in the world. It is said to have been, and I believe this is correct, the richest colony that has ever existed in history. It accounted for by itself about 2/3 at its peak of France's overseas trade. In 1791, the Africans who had been forced into sugar and other plantation work in Saint-Domingue arose in rebellion. I say Africans because the life expectancy on these sugar islands from the point of arrival was between 5 and 7 years, depending on the place. And so anyone who was working on a sugar plantation was born in Africa and typically came from very far-flung, disparate parts of Africa, which was a matter of strategy by the Europeans to prevent the concentration of any one ethnic group or linguistic group in one place, so that it made it harder for them to organize politically and to resist. Anyway, in 1791, there's a long history of prior rebellions prior to this, but in 1791, the Africans of Saint-Domingue arose and fought for their freedom successfully initially, and the three greatest empires, really compressing heavily here, but the three greatest empires of this era, namely Spain, Britain, and France, or I could put it in a different order. France tried twice. Spain, France, Britain, and France all tried to defeat the slave uprising and to take over the sugar production of Haiti because it was such an enormous source of wealth, and the Africans defeated each of them. When France tried under Napoleon a second time to do this, it sent the largest convoy of ships that it had ever sent in its history overseas to try to defeat the Africans, and it was defeated itself. And this created an economic crisis in France, which forced Napoleon to sell his American territories to the government of Thomas Jefferson. These territories, which we know of in our history books as the Louisiana Purchase, constituted all or part of 15 American states and doubled the size of the young American Republic. And they're concentrated in the middle part of the country. And at the heart of this territory is the Mississippi River Valley. The victory of the enslaved Africans in Haiti created a kind of terror in the minds of the founding father generation of American leaders in what we know of as the Old South, places like Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia and the like, where there was also plantation agriculture, mostly involving at that time tobacco and rice. And these people, led by Thomas Jefferson, said, we better get rid of these Africans, not all of them, but we need to weed them out. We can't have them concentrated in such numbers in this part of the country. Let's send them westward. And this creates the second great migration of Africans in the history of the modern world. The first one being the 12.5 million people who were landed across the Atlantic into the so-called New World. This one is the forced marching, because most of them were transported by foot on their own power, across the United States to the Mississippi Valley, where they were very quickly put to work in the growing of cotton. And cotton agriculture in industrial prison labor camps takes off in the 1790s in the United States, and in the space of less than 2 decades becomes, by a very large distance, the single greatest economic product of the United States. Its #1 export by far, and not incidentally, the sine qua non ingredient upon which England's Industrial Revolution is based. England's Industrial Revolution we know of as typically spoken of as a matter of ingeniosity by clever English people who figured out how to build looms and how to organize labor in the Lancashire region of the country of this audience for the most part. And what a wonderful story. These very clever people figure out how to do these things, and next thing you know, England is rich and powerful, right? This all proceeds from industrial prison labor camps. And so the cotton is overwhelmingly sourced in enslavement in the Mississippi Valley. But more than that, a lot of the wealth associated with this boom, both in the United States itself and in Britain, is based on secondary and tertiary businesses and industries that support or feed from either the growth of cotton or the production of textiles. And so what are we talking about? We're talking about shipping, of course. We're talking about banking. We're talking about insurance. We're talking about transportation of other types, railroads in the United States. British companies and investors were very important in this. All of these things were centered on this exploitation of Black labor. And I will stop my opening remarks there. I think I've said quite a lot. I've also left out quite a lot, but I stopped with this idea of exploitation of Black labor because this brings us back to the title of my book, which is Born in Blackness, of course, and my contention that modernity is centered on this phenomenon, the exploitation of Black labor across the Atlantic world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Howard. That was really, really good, really compelling story, and a lot more to be said. And I'm sure all of those of you that are listening also want to probably ask follow-up questions. So I know some of you already have put questions in the chat box. Feel free to write anything you want Howard to talk more about into the Q&A box. And before that, we have Toby to give any comments or questions that you'd like to ask to Howard.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you so much, Howard, for that. I mean, it's, as Ingrid said, very, very powerful presentation of the theme of your book. Although, as Ingrid also said, we and as you mentioned as well, we have scope, I think, to discuss the latter period as well, particularly because there's so much to be said. And I'll just start with a question I had about your presentation of the early history, because that's, I mean, as you know, that's my, the major focus of my own work. And I think, rather like you, I had the experience of discovering as a young man that everything I'd somehow learned somehow, and I wasn't quite sure how, when I first was in Africa and then began reading about it, was wrong, essentially. And a lot of my life since then has been to try and unpick that, and that involves a couple of processes. Of course, it involves a lot of learning, but it also, as I think you mentioned in your talk, and as comes out so powerfully in the book, is also a process of unlearning. We have so much to unlearn. So I mean, I suppose, and you had this wonderful phrase in the introduction, which I just thought I'd read out. You said, our understanding of the world still comes down to us in many cases as hagiography. And I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, because it's so influential in shaping the narrative you're trying to unpick on the one hand, and on the other hand, it also speaks perhaps to the work that we all of us have to do as scholars, but also as educators in trying to get beyond that hagiography as history.
Sure. Thank you, Toby. So there are a lot of ways to express this. One of them has just come up in the sort of last bit of my remarks, where I talk about the Industrial Revolution and how, the normal ways. I don't know how it's taught in England or in Britain, but in America, it's taught very much in the way I just described. That this is kind of the result of cleverness, that, capitalism and, genius and entrepreneurial spirit and one thing after another, and boom, there you go. And the dark exploitative side of this is completely left out of the story. There's no credit given to the sweat and the blood that went into the making of this wealth. It's completely skipped, right? And so that is pretty clearly an example of hagiography. There are not a lot of better examples, right? But it really penetrates this entire story. And I want to be careful as I try to engage with this, right? I don't think as problematic as it is, I don't think hagiography is an unusual thing historically speaking. I think people, whether as individuals or as societies everywhere, try to identify positive virtues in themselves to explain their successes. I think this is kind of a human tendency, all right? We look for nice things that we can credit ourselves with to explain our successes. And we want to credit cheating or violence or exploitation or the enslavement of others or, bad faith or whatever else that was probably quite significant in terms of the experience. Another really good example from the book for me, and my book really is kind of a one after another succession of these sorts of hagiographic events, is the Enlightenment, right? So the Enlightenment, as we understand it, is the product of these noble ideas generated by very intelligent, high-minded people who, in England and to some subsequent extent in the United States and maybe a couple of other places, right, just figure out a way to model virtuous human society, right? In the telling of the story of the Enlightenment, we completely omit the fact that the standards of living, the privilege, and the ability, in fact, of those people, the individuals that we credit with this high-mindedness, was almost always predicated directly or indirectly on the enslavement of other people. The founding fathers of the United States, the most important ones in terms of the elaboration of our early notions of the Republic and of law and of Constitution, were slave owners. They got to think their great thoughts. I spent last summer a day visiting the plantation of James Madison, one of the writers of the American, very important author of the American Constitution, and was quite struck. I didn't know this before I went there. This is from the part of Virginia where my own family is from. I toured his plantation and entered his writing room. And the actual desk that he sat down to compose his thoughts at was on a second story of a plantation house that looked out upon the fields where Africans were working. In other words, he was writing his grand ideas, looking out into the fields directly, unobstructed, onto the scenes of slave labor.
Well, I mean, that's an incredibly powerful image and really encapsulates, in a way, it encapsulates much of the argument of the latter part of the book, actually, because it's the latter part of the book where you really get into this and particularly, there's the middle part where you're talking about Africa and Europe and the capture of Africans and the way in which that then seeds the situation in the New World. But then but it's the product of that labor, as you say, and that has so many ramifications. Of course, in the way in which history has been written and produced and erased on the one hand, but to this day, of course, the questions about reparations, the questions about global inequality, which is getting worse and worse by the year. And so I wonder, thinking about the impact which that history has had and the way it has been erased, is there a way in which you think speaking about this history, replacing it, reinserting it, can also have a role in those debates about reparations and about modern inequality?
One can only hope, right? We are, in my country, the United States, in a very dark moment of reaction where, it is considered by a large segment of this country's population a kind of offense, an unpardonable offense to talk about injustice, especially racial injustice, and where people proudly, increasingly so, exhibit their denialism of the sorts of things that I'm talking about, and try to place anyone who would who would dig into these sorts of histories on the defensive and to write them off as being, politically correct is too polite, right? There's much more aggressive language being employed day by day to try to marginalize people who would try to sort of look at the undersides of these stories, right? In Britain, I don't want to pose an expert.
It's not any better, really.
I can't speak from a position of expertise on the British side of this story, but insofar as I've encountered it, right, and I'm not talking about the popular response, the elite response is rather similar. And there's a long history that I'm aware of.
Actually, you write about that very, very well. Towards the end of the book, you compare the northern states of the US in the Civil War era with Britain, and in both, you compare the moral story of slavery as a mythologized one in both, and we kind of, I think, see the legacy of that in this discussion. But I've got one final question for you, Howard, before I open the floor to others, because I think one of the really important things I found in the book is, again, towards the end of it, where you make this really strong argument about the question of the Civil War, and then the way in which African Americans fought for their own liberation in the first place, but also in preserving the Union, actually was a foundational moment in modern democracy, which has been completely written out of that history. I wondered if you could just speak a bit more to that.
Sure. So listen, one of the most remarkable things about your question is that the arguments which I employ and extend and reintroduce to the public's attention were in fact quite persuasively elaborated 100 years ago by W.E.B. Du Bois, and have subsequently been articulated by others. That it is in fact, so most of what we've been talking about so far has been how Africans created the basis in wealth that allowed, going back to the opening discussion, I mentioned Asia in my conversation, allowed for the divergence of the West. Let me define the West as a condominium between Western Europe and especially Britain and North America. It was African labor that created the West. Prior to 1820, 4 times more people were brought across the Atlantic from Africa than from Europe. And it was the labor taken from those people that created the basis for the takeoff of, first, for the creation of the West, because North America would not have been economically viable, certainly not on anything like the timeline we are familiar with, had it not been for this overwhelmingly productive pool of expropriated labor, right? And so this provides the basis for the takeoff, the divergence that the Asians are wondering, how did this happen to us? Why is it that this Western world became so rich and successful and eclipsed us in a distinct moment in time, right? But there's more to it, coming to your question, and that is, not only did this African labor provide for the takeoff and the divergence, but it actually created the conditions for the birth of democracy in Britain and created the basis or the salvation of democracy in the United States. And this comes specifically to the point of your question, which is after a great period of reluctance and resistance out of desperation, Abraham Lincoln finally conceded to the idea of allowing Black people to fight for the cause of the North in the Civil War. And it was that contribution which propelled the North decisively to victory in the late stages of war, precisely at the moment when white people in states like New York, which was one of the most populous states then as now in this country, were becoming quite bitter and resistant to the idea of dying in larger numbers for the sake of true democracy in the United States.
So, I mean, we could talk for a long time, but I think I probably ought to pause there and allow those who are with us to ask questions. But I hope to come back towards the end. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Howard and Toby. We just received a question on the Q&A. I would invite others who are participating to pop up their questions in the Q&A section. Unfortunately, you won't be able to ask the question directly, but I will ask it on your behalf. So the question is, Howard, for all the gold that Portugal obtained that revolutionized their economy, what did the Ghanaians get in return? What was of interest to them of which Portugal had access?
Very good question. So the Portuguese were mostly focused on gold, let's say, for the first, speaking off the top of my head here, so I don't want to be too definitive about this, but so if the gold's discovered in 1471, it's not until the late 1500s that, and in Ghana itself, not until the 1600s that the slave trade, as we know it, the transatlantic slave trade becomes for the Portuguese, the primary kind of source of economic activity. Anyway, so for the Ghanaians, as we're calling them, the principal interest in terms of commerce were worked metal goods that we call, one technical term for them, as Toby will be very familiar with, is manillas, which are usually bars of bronze or brass or things like iron sometimes, and textiles. And the Europeans arrive in the game of commerce with West Africa because Europe is Europe, climatically speaking, only with wool and later with flax, or some to some extent with flaxen cloth. And so these are were not actually highly prized by people in West Africa for reasons of climate. Their woolens are of course warm, and the West Africans didn't really need heavily warm gear. And so this, as contacts with Asia began to be developed in the early 1500s, this creates the first of what kind of a forgotten or never emphasized triangular trade, where India is brought into the equation. The Europeans, led by the Portuguese, begin sourcing cotton textiles in India, which they bring to West Africa and sell in large quantities to the Ghanaians and to others in exchange for their gold and for other goods that they wanted.
Excellent, thank you. Another question just came in. Firstly, this is from Maria. Thank you so much for your fantastic talk. I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on how the idealized ideas about modernity also continue to sustain notions of being human today, in the sense that racial capitalism today continues to underpin European and American racist notions of who counts as subjects.
Yes, so it comes down back to the question of hagiography that Toby asked earlier. And I don't think, again, that Europeans or Americans or Westerners are unique in their inclination toward hagiography. What's special about them is the degree of their success. And so, this divergence through the creation of the thing called the West. We throw around the term the West a lot without really thinking very often carefully about what the West means. So if we accept for this conversation, my working definition, the condominium between Western Europe and especially Britain with North America, this was one of the most powerful events in world history. And so the bigger the power in terms of the success, the bigger the hagiography. And the hagiography, specific hagiography involved in this. I've been fortunate in my career to work in other parts of the world as well. I know China, I speak Chinese. I know Japan, I speak Japanese. They have hagiography too, right? But the West's hagiography, just like the West became hegemonic in a certain period of time, their hagiography became hegemonic. The hagiography of the West is that there's something special about white people and the virtues of white people. And it comes down to, work ethic and intelligence and cleverness and philosophy and religion, and you put those all in a pot and you boil them down and you get this very special thing that we don't typically racialize it when we speak about it, but we accept, at least passively, the idea that these are there's something supremely virtuous in the combination of these things which coincide with a European civilization. And that's simply not true. For most of its history, Europe was not a particularly distinguished part of the world in any measurable way, right? And that's not because Europeans are bad. It's just that's the way it worked out. And in a special period in time, Europe kind of gets its act together and then takes off and diverges. And because of our will toward hagiography, we don't think of the underside of that. We think of the virtuous side of that. And so there you have it.
Before our next question, Toby, I wanted to ask if you wanted to chime in. Please feel free to chime in with your responses as well. We have 2 questions on deck. If you wanted to do it now, if not, after the 2 questions too.
I can say some things towards the end. It might be allow Howard to field the questions and then just sort of general comment. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine. So this question speaks to my research too, and this is what I was thinking too, Howard. Thank you for your fascinating introductory remarks. What role do you see religion and Christianity having in Portuguese encounters with West Africa?
It's a very complicated question. And I think Toby knows Toby certainly knows this in greater depth than I do. But Christianity was vehiculated by the Portuguese and the Spanish in varied and very interesting ways, right? On the one hand, it was the sort of basis in legitimacy in their minds for the takeover of the lives of other human beings. This gave ecclesiastical blessing to the enslavement of other people, and that it allowed them to say and to receive the okay from the Vatican to capture and trade in other human beings because they were being essentially saved from paganism and from the horrors of godlessness, right? And in some cases from the influences of Islam, right? As this, I say this is there's a varied history. It's very textured because as the prison industrial labor complex took off, that we call in our prettified way the plantation world, the amount of wealth that was created was just staggering, right? And historically decisive in so many ways. And so as mammon began to grow in its magnitude, right? The Portuguese, and especially, but others as well, began to find ways of very quickly kind of cutting the religious piece out of this, or doing it only in the most expedited and kind of symbolic ways, like sometimes literally on the plank as you're leading an enslaved person onto a ship, saying a prayer and then saying, okay, we've converted you, right? I actually invite Toby to add whatever he'd like to say.
Thank you, Howard, actually, because I was going to change my mind actually on this one, because I realized that this would be a good moment for me to come in. I mean, I think it's really important. Religion has a fundamental role here and questions of value, but not only through the role of Christianity, I would argue, but also the way in which Europeans and the Portuguese, to begin with, perceived African religions, I think is very important. And we know this because of the term fetish. Now, the term fetish, of course, came out of the Portuguese fetiche, or what has been made, found objects within the African shrines, very many different shrines. And it, of course, became used over time as a way of undermining and belittling African approaches to religious value and African conceptions of the world. But of course, it also became a fundamental concept in materialist historiography when it was transubstantiated, if you like, by Marx, and the concept of the commodity fetish. And so it became a vehicle for both economic and religious value, and the way that it grew out of religious value and the way in which that was initially seen tells us just how important that kind of shift in concepts of value was and how fundamental the role of religion was in that.
Let me just say, just sort of final little point. There are so many things that could be said about this question, but one of the things that we have somehow forgotten in this history is that the Catholic Church and some of its sub-organizations were among the most important exploiters of slaves in the entire history of enslavement, right? It's poorly remembered or sometimes completely forgotten that Mexico itself was a very important early site of slavery, and the Jesuits operated the most extensive and profitable prison industrial labor camps in Mexico using African labor. The Catholic Church in other places did similarly, right? And there's really been very little accounting of this and very little discussion of this. And so this is kind of a lost piece of this history that is in desperate need of exploration.
That is absolutely correct.
There are quite a few questions coming in, Howard. So I'll just, if you don't mind, I'll give you two at a time. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question is, with the criticism you publicized about the lack of acknowledgement and transparency of the role of Africa in modernization, what would you argue should happen now as the truth unfolds, either now or in the future?
Well, so I'm assuming that most of my listeners are in Britain or have deep associations with Britain. And I think that, so I'll address myself to what I imagine as a British piece of that question, right? As best I understand it, Britain's relationship in terms of public education and common discourse is centered on what is typically kind of posited as a heroic role that Britain played in the abolition of slavery. So slavery becomes an important thing to talk about within Britain in schools or in educational circles, insofar as one can talk about how Britain at a particular moment in time rose to the fore in terms of abolishing slavery. And I think in framing the story of slavery that way, this is a matter of hagiography and how human societies universally try to seek virtue in their own myth making, right? Britain omits the fact, the central fact, that Britain was the greatest beneficiary of this phenomenon of all, and the leading slave trader in, roughly speaking, the latter third of the transatlantic slave trade, right? And so somehow you get to this frame, despite that, where what's important to talk about is how we abolish slavery without ever really talking about how we benefited from slavery. And so if we want to, think about how to restart these conversations and really open ourselves to interrogation, I think for a British audience, that's where you should begin. Like, start teaching people about the role that Britain actually did play in the transatlantic slave trade, how deeply Britain profited, and England before it, from the transatlantic slave trade, and the fact that Britain was a leader in this.
I'll ask you two questions, Howard, and you've touched upon both, but it might be good to just sum it up. The hagiography that you referred to has been mirrored in the dominant global history approach as it has developed in the last 20 years, or has global history informed the critique you have developed? So that's the first question. And the second one is, to what extent were Europeans aware of the needs to use slavery and slave trade for increasing capital accumulation? How consciously were colonizers and political ideologues embracing slavery as a means to establish global dominance?
Well, let me do the second one first. So the second one's very easy, right? I talked about in the beginning of my talk how the contemporary accounts of the Portuguese talk about their obsession with connecting with West Africa, right? The contemporary accounts of Europeans in Britain, especially, England and then Britain in the 17th and 18th century, and also in France, I quote from leading thinkers in these periods in both of the countries, who essentially say, this is the most important thing in the world to us, meaning the industrial economic complex built around enslavement. They say it clearly. The record is very clear. It's just said in the most unadulterated fashion. And so, that's not really, it's now that we don't remember it. It's now that we deny it. It's now that we construct other frames. And back then there was no real shame there was no shame yet about this because of the power of mammon, which I referred to earlier, right? So the first question is one I'm always pleased to talk about, and that is, and this is not just a question of humility and certainly not false humility, but there are very few things that I discovered uniquely me. I pioneered the knowledge of in writing this book. And I don't feel any embarrassment in saying that. The shocking thing is how little of what I wrote about is known even among well-educated people, even among historians who work on the Atlantic world, how little of this stuff is known to people. However, almost nothing in my book did I come up with firsthand for the first time. And so there's a paradox there that I find really, really interesting. And so what's the intellectual history of this? It's a deep intellectual history. All of the arguments that I've made exist in the record somewhere. And what I did is, live in the archives and make connections and put things together. But I'm really building my work on the work of other people. And I'm not flattering Toby to say this, but Toby was immensely important to me. But then there were other people going way, way back. I've referred to W.E.B. Du Bois, and there are many, many others. Eric Williams, many others, too many to name. And so this isn't a question of unearthing history that nobody knew before. It's a question of restoring knowledge and making connections between sort of siloed pieces of history that others haven't necessarily always formatted this way before, and of getting it in front of the public. And I'm not an academic historian, so in no way am I embarrassed to say that I'm drawing on people who did vital work before me in all of the things I write about.
If I could just interject one thing there, and I think it's really important, because you're right, Howard. I mean, these arguments have been made ever since when, in fact, a book I know you'll be fascinated to read by my colleague in the UK, José Nafafe, at Bristol University, which we published later this year, is about the abolitionist who was a prince of Ndongo in Congo, who went to the Vatican in the 1680s to put forward many of the arguments that you've discussed as an argument for abolitionism in the 1680s. So these are arguments which time and again have been put forward and then in one way or another suppressed. So we're all building on the shoulders of the first abolitionists, really, who of course were the people who experienced what it meant to be enslaved.
Right. I look forward to that work. I cite Nafafe elsewhere on other things in my book, so I'm not surprised.
Excellent. We have time for two quick questions. One has already come in, so if anybody has any last burning questions, feel free to pop it in the Q&A or in the chat. But the question that I have with me now is the oceanic phenomenon of currents diverging from all sides towards a central point commonplace in the Atlantic, or is there a well-known and logical location that may have been reached by the early Mali expedition?
So we're speaking in specific of something called the Canary current, which has played a very important role in what we're calling Atlantic history. And you see very distinct and long-lasting, meaning over immense timeframes, kind of semi-permanent patterns of ocean circulation and of wind in the Atlantic Ocean. And so I talked about it not being surprising that an empire that we know of as Mali that existed in the 13 and 1400s should have thought that there might be a world on the other side of the Atlantic, right? But it's also not surprising that they would have understood in ways that the Europeans did not, the existence of set ocean currents, because even though they didn't have, West Africans didn't have large masted sailing vessels in this period, they did go to sea to fish, right? And one must assume that they also had long distance fishing, right? And so it was when Christopher Columbus established himself through marriage in the Canary Islands that we have reason to believe he came to understand these ocean currents, and that this was key to his ability to make a breakthrough across the Atlantic to the Americas, and know that he would, because his mastery of an understanding of the currents, know that he could get back to Europe afterwards. Because if he, tacked to the correct latitude, the current would bear him back to Europe, right? And so at one latitude, the current goes this way, at another latitude, it goes that way. And if you are in the right intermediate zone, there's a sort of violent conflict between the two different directions.
As a good follow-up to that question, Howard, Zainab is asking what eventually happened to the Mali Empire.
That's a great question. So the Mali Empire, and I get into this a little bit in my book, the Mali Empire. So Mansa Musa goes to Cairo in 1324 and 5. And this, as it happens, is just a few years before the introduction of firearms into the Middle East. And firearms were, of course, invented in China. And so firearms had transited to the Middle East via the large Asian landmass bit by bit, and finally reached the Middle East just a little while after Mansa Musa was in the Middle East with 18 tons of gold. And so I raised this counterfactual in my book, which is just a fun thing to speculate, right, about. And that is, if firearms had arrived just a few years earlier in the Middle East and had been present at the time of Mansa Musa's arrival, Mansa Musa being the emperor of Mali, and which is a kingdom that had very capable metallurgy skills of its own, and him being the richest person perhaps in the history of the world, is it possible to imagine that Mansa Musa wouldn't have become interested in firearms and wouldn't have taken back to Mali with him some of the expertise needed to make firearms himself? He took back other kinds of expertise, architectural, religious, et cetera, right? It's almost impossible for me to imagine, had via this counterfactual firearms been present in the Middle East when Mansa Musa shows up, that Mali would not soon thereafter have been armed with firearms and have it had its own industry of firearms, which, if that had happened, one could imagine would have very dramatically changed the course of world history, right? Instead, subsequent to Mansa Musa, under the successor empire called Songhai, the territory that Mali occupied becomes invaded by one of the North African kingdoms that Mali was trying to make an end run around for trading purposes, right? So this long line of empires in Sahelian Africa that Mali was a part of is sort of defeated and unravels under the after the invasion from North Africa by men with firearms, right? And so this is just, you can just, the possibilities are endless of alternative outcomes here. And it is the unraveling of the Songhai emperor which creates vast movements of people throughout West Africa as disorder spreads, and as this very large, geographically extensive, powerful kingdom sort of evaporates, right? And this debility and flow of refugees and chaos arises precisely at the moment, by another historical accident, that Europeans become interested in acquiring human beings for sale into a slave trade across the Atlantic for the first time. And so the counterfactual is, maybe Mali gets guns, the empires in the Sahel don't dissolve, the Europeans show up, and there's a very strong centralizing West African polity, an empire in fact, and the Europeans say, well, we have to treat with them diplomatically and not feed on them for enslavement, and and we have a very different story over the next few centuries. But that's all just in the realm of imagination. It didn't happen that way.
Well, and then the last question, which I think we all have on our minds, is where do you go from here? Do you have plans for a next project building on Born in Blackness?
Yes, so I don't want to speak in too great detail about this right now because I'm a little bit superstitious, but this book ends in the subtitle with the Second World War. And so I want to take the story forward and look at how the world of Africa, and via the world of Africa, how the Atlantic world begins to change in the post-war period. And so that's what I'm working on now.
Very cool. Thank you very much, Howard. We have a couple of minutes, so I will leave it with you for closing thoughts before I wrap it up.
I think Toby had said that he wanted to maybe say something at the end. So
well, I mean, I just wanted to say, I just wanted to say to everybody who's been participating, I wanted to show the book because it's a beautiful book and it really is an important book. It's so well written and powerful, and you have so many great examples in it. I really hope that, I know it's been getting a wide audience already in the US, and I hope it will continue to get that there and obviously here, because it really is an important contribution to, as you say, what is staggering really from it as a historian of this topic is not that, as you say, it's so little known or part of discussions of the general framework of history. And that's, this book I think can make a decisive contribution to shifting that narrative. But as we know, it's an accumulated centuries of history, which is quite hard to budge. But thank you, Howard, so much for sharing it, sparing the time, because I know just how busy you are. But sparing the time. I think you tweeted last week you were addressing all the African heads of state at the UN. So we're very lucky and privileged that you have shared your time with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toby. It's been a real pleasure to meet you this way, and I look forward to meeting you in person. And
indeed,
thank you, Ingrid and Sudhir, for your hospitality, and thank you. I didn't see the audience here, but I assume that there's actually people out there, and want to thank you for your attention and your interest in the topic. And I'm not going to make a crude pitch for the book, but if you care to read it, I'm delighted, and look forward to hearing from those of you who wish to sort of reach out in any way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Howard. I'll make a pitch on your behalf. Howard's publishers have kindly offered a 25% discount. That link is in the chat. So if you would like to buy a copy of the book, the link is available in the chat with a 25% discount. Thank you so much, Howard and Toby. It was a fascinating session and so enlightening. Coming up in 2 weeks' time, we have the next in our series called Decolonizing Pandemic Governance by Professor Saikiko Fukudapar. You can sign up on the link also in the chat function. But until then, thank you very much, and we'll hopefully see you all at our next event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.